European Feudalism in the Middle Ages by Agyenim Boateng, Jaclyn Prillaman, Juliene Sollars, and Samuel White. So in this presentation, I'll be talking about the land structures, which is how the housing structures benefited the social system, the social mobility, which was how the social system lacked a way for social mobility, the social pyramid and the levels of influence within the feudal system, the clergy authority, how the church played a big role in the feudal society, the lordship, which is how the laws were made and enforced and by whom, the economic structure, the flow of goods and services, and taxes, to whom and how the people paid taxes. This is a map of France in 1447. You can see the different houses and basically the manners of France in 1477. So the land structures in the feudal system were basically in two different categories, the castle and the manor and the fiefdom. And these territories were split up into territories from about the 10th century to the 16th century. And the castle, that was the center of the feudal territory. It was a fortified structure, sometimes with a big wall and a moat, that a noble and their family was housed. The manor and the fiefdoms, they were small estates, small plots of land that the nobles gave to lords to manage. And some lords managed multiple powers, which was a big sign of power in the feudal society. The more land you had, the more powerful you were. And then the land was worked by serfs and peasants, and they lived on the land and they provided labor for the lord and were most often forced into providing this labor. Social mobility during the feudal society, it was non-existent during this time period because the economic, social, and religious structures were very, very rigid. And people were really only bound to each other by promises of loyalty. And then the land, all of it belonged to the monarch. And the monarch divided up this land that he didn't want to the nobles. And then the lords were granted land by the nobles, and they promised to assist the nobles and the monarch in times of war through the knights. And the peasants made food, did other services such as farming, and basically, did all of the services for the nobles, the knights, and the monarchs and such. And they rented land also in exchange for protection from these lords and knights. And then the feudal lords, they have complete control over the local populations and very easily oppress their peoples with no intervention from those higher up in the social ladder, such as the monarch and the nobles. This is the feudal Europe power pyramid. At the top, you have the Pope, and he was the head of the Catholic Church. Below him, you have the king, and he owned all of the land and distributed it. The lords and nobles, they were privileged elite families that ran the manors, and they got their land from the king. And the more land they had, the more powerful they were. Below the lords and nobles, you have the knights, and they were soldiers on horseback most often that fought for the king, and they were loaned out by the nobles or the lords. They also fought for the nobles or lords in petty disputes. And then the peasants were also at the bottom. They worked as farmers or workers or servants in the manors. The role of the Catholic Church in the feudal society was very pronounced at every level. The Catholic Church had its own land, laws, and taxes. That just goes to show how big the Catholic Church had a role in this society. And in the eyes of most in this society, the Pope was seen as God's representation on earth. Nobody wanted to mess with the Pope. And then the lack of an emperor after the fall of the Roman Empire, this left the Pope and the Catholic Church with the most powerful and influential people in the land. And many in the feudal society feared being excommunicated by the Pope, which basically meant being cut off by the Catholic Church, which is not good, especially in this time period. And then priests in the feudal times were the only literate ones in the village, and this left them to keep all the records mostly, and they also often collected the taxes as well. And then this is also, just like the pyramid, it's the governing bodies under feudalism. But if you look at it in terms of the government, you have the king at the top. And then below that, you have earls and barons, which are basically the nobles and the lords. And then you have the knights, sort of in the middle, closer to the bottom. And then you have the peasants at the very bottom. It even looks like they have fields down at the bottom where they farmed. And so the lordship, as the land was controlled by lords and barons, they demanded that all who live within their territory follow their laws. And under this system, they acquired personal militias who enforced these laws, such as the knights and such. And these laws were not ordained by the king. The king really didn't have much say in what the lords and barons did within their territories. So the minting, the taxation, the lawmaking, and judicial process was left up to the Lord to decide and do as the Lord saw fit. And you were provided protection if you lived within the walls, and you were also expected to provide services and pay taxes as well to the Lord, and especially everybody above the lords and the ladders, as for gratitude. And the economic structure was split up basically into two different portions. It's the money and the goods. And this economic system was called manorialism, and it was the core of the life was around the manor. And so coins weren't used that often, and basically how much land you had was how wealthy you were. And the king owned all of the land and would give out the portions as he saw fit. So if you were in good standing with the king, you were basically wealthy. And as far as goods, land was given in exchange for service a lot. And since the king gave out the land, lords and nobles in return provided their loyalty, protection, and service. Knights and vassals would get the land from the lords, and they were provided food, shelter, weapons, horses, and money in exchange for their military service. And then the peasants and the serf farmed the land that they were given by vassals in return for protection. This is the flow of money and goods within the feudal society. So at the top you have the king, and the king grants land to the barons, which are the nobles and the lords. And the nobles and the lords, they provide money and knights to the king. And then below the barons, you have the barons grant land to the knights. And then they provide protection and military service to the nobles and the lords and the monarch. And then the knights grant land to the villeins, which the villeins are the serfs and the peasants, and they provide food and services when demanded by all above them in the power pyramid. And so taxation during feudalism was basically raising money for royal and government charges. And the main form of taxes were through land, and they also paid for by duties and mint coins. Through the feudal system, taxes were collected from lords, nobles, peasants, and serfs. So the only person exempt from taxes would be the monarch. And then the lords and nobles had to pay the king taxes by giving through land. And the lords and nobles paid the king taxes, usually in the form of loyalty. And the lords and nobles gave or offered land to knights for peasants and serfs to work and live on. And they collected taxes from the peasants and serfs for using the land as well. And it wasn't always paid with coins. Peasants used agricultural products and their services to pay these lords and nobles for the protection and for the land that they lived and worked on. And the serfs and the peasants were the lowest on the pyramid. They had to pay taxes for using the land and also pay rent for living within the manor. So they were hit with this double whammy that kept them at the lowest on the pyramid, never able to rise. So in conclusion, these topics that we covered today are all very key aspects in the feudal society, and they're all interconnected. And without one, the whole system could have collapsed. And the feudal system arose out of the chaos that was left by the collapse of the Roman Empire. And that's the reason that the feudal system is so rigid today. This is our works cited and bibliography page. This is basically the sites that we got all of our information from.